welcome Tim. We're here with Tim Maughan, author, journalist, novelist, journalism work, and I guess fiction as well, has appeared in places regularly, BBC, Vice, Motherboard, host of other places. I find him fascinating because of his work, not just as a writer in a box of writing, but with like architects and artists in all kinds of, especially technology-saturated environments. So welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, man.
So we're here to talk a bit about the Digital Economies Lab and some of the thinking and work that's happened around this research laboratory here at Artengine. You have been involved with a small group as you kind of engage the idea of organized labor and in relation to the creative domain. So I guess let's start with the sort of simple question of what drew you to this idea of a union and creative industries or the artistic world? What brought you around those two ideas?
In all honesty, it came out of that first initial DEL meeting, that first weekend we had. We were over at Deloitte's offices, that was just weird, but that's a weird space, but that's a whole other video. And we were sat around talking, and the things that people were, we would, that day, as you remember, we did a bunch of exercises where people were talking about what their concerns were and their hopes and stuff, and the thing that came out a lot, the issues that were coming out a lot were stuff around labor, and specifically around payment, it seemed to me. The thing I kept hearing people saying was that, like, there was a lack of transparency in how much money they should be making as artists. They'd often find themselves in shows or performances or whatever, and they were asked they were asked how much they expected to be paid by clients rather than being given a figure. And at the same time, they suspected or found out later even that other people they were working with were getting paid more than them, or in some cases getting paid less to them, and that inequality felt wrong to them. And this kept coming out. That was kind of the thing that kept coming out the most that first morning, if I remember. And it just made me, I think I literally just stood up or put my hand up or something around the session and said, it sounds like what you need is a union. Because that's what unions are for, right? They're there to do a lot of things. But for me, primarily, one of the things they're there for is to create solidarity when it comes to payment, when it comes to labor value, right? It's to argue for their members to have an equitable and just payment structure, and that their labor to be valued in the right ways. And that just struck me as, and I come out as well of, you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a journalist. I'm a freelance journalist, but a lot of my friends increasingly are becoming freelance for reasons that we might get into in more of the conversation. But a lot of them had just spent the last 2 years up until that point, like fighting to unionize places. Like, I write for Vice a lot. I used to. I still do. Vice were fighting to build a union. BuzzFeed were fighting to build a union. And talking to those people and watching them and seeing they were organizing was really inspiring for me. To watch a couple of years to see union, especially in the US. I mean, obviously I'm British and moving here from Europe. I think unions I'm not too sure about Canada yet, but in the US, unions are viewed very, very differently. It's very much a dirty word for a long time, especially in the creative industries. Outside of Hollywood, ironically, where unions are very powerful, and as they should be, in the TV and film industry, the unions are incredibly powerful. Sometimes not always in the best ways, but still they exist, and they're a structure there for hopefully for people to mold and use. But it felt like it just felt to me from those discussions of what we were talking about, the kind of solidarity we kind of build was an organized labor issue. Right? And whether that's about pay or working conditions or intellectual property and stuff like this, these all seem to be issues of exploitation of labor, and it just struck me as that was the way to move forward with this.
So, we've had this conversation a bit before, but I do wonder about how over the course of this research have you been thinking about that question of what labor consists of in the creative context? I think in some of the ways that we've seen and do see, like you mentioned, Hollywood is a great example of like, you have very specific skill sets that organize around, you're in, the being a cinematographer is a sort of, you're welcomed into a very clear barrier around the skill set. And is a skill set the right organizing force, or have you sort of come to think, is there another organizing principle that would be useful within a broader definition, whether it's artists or creative sector or creative industries?
That's a good question, and I don't know that I know an answer to that. The skill set thing is, it's incredibly hard to clarify and to specify and to use fairly, I think, and that's a real issue. There's a whole minefield of issues there that I think to a certain extent we probably hand-waved over a little bit with the project we did. We were just inviting people to be artists, and I think that's something good, and I think that's something that we should probably seize upon in a way when we're talking about this stuff. I don't have any formal qualifications in any of my practices at all. I haven't done a day's worth of studying how to write formally since I was 17. Okay, and I'm 47 now, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so it's 30 years since I had any kind of education or qualifications. Whereas I know other writers, who have MFAs, have been through MFA programs. I know journalists who've been to journalism school, which is why I'm always a little uncomfortable calling myself a journalist. I kind of fell into it, but that's very typical now. A lot of people fall into journalism, a lot of people fall into art exactly the same way. And some of the best art I see, I would say now, but that's not even true. Some of the art I hold dearest and have done all my life was made by people who have zero education in anything sometimes, right? Let alone art, especially when it comes to music. Some of the best books I've read were written by people who have no formal qualifications. And we're looking at a world now where some of the best art I see on a daily basis comes out of platforms like TikTok. Genuinely amazing work being done on platforms like TikTok and YouTube and places, which is a whole other side of the discussion about what these platforms represent and how they exploit our labor, both as artists and audiences.
Yeah.
But it's still, you can't deny that good art is being made on these platforms, right? So by people with apparently no qualifications often. So I'm very cautious about making it too skills-based, that qualification to be part of a union.
And that in that way, do you think that that's sort of part of the one of the driving forces behind what that exploration that you guys are doing, trying to speculate on what those questions would be if we remove skill set as an organizing factor? What else will we, and how do you what kinds of questions did you come up with or came to mind?
That was very much, we came up with questions rather than solutions. I think that was very much the point of the project, really. That kind of idea is, if people is identifying as an artist enough, and I think it has to be, right. I think getting bogged down in any discussion where you're trying to say the opposite to that isn't. It's an interesting philosophical discussion that makes very little sense in the 21st century. And secondly, it's not for a union to do because the union has more important shit to be doing, right? To be frank, And I think that was kind of, we came up with a bunch of speculative questions that we kind of put together in a manifesto. My head's kind of blanked on them now, but they're on the website. But they were very much asking participants or audiences or whoever's looking at this stuff to kind of invite them into forming the union so that it fits them, which I think is an important thing for a union to do. That it melds itself to its members rather than the other way, whilst at the same time having certain standards, especially around diversity and how people are treated and codes of conduct, but also around principles around labour. Having set minimums, I think, is what a union needs to do. We will not allow you to work for less. this amount.
Yeah.
The fight for the union should be for all those members that want that to be a living wage. That ultimately the fight, whether it's realistic or not, is that we get our members a living wage. Right. That's how I saw it anyway. Personally, I'm talking very personally at this point. But when we threw it out there, we threw it out there as a way to hopefully people can come to this manifesto / question list that we've written. It's a weird manifesto, and at every point is a question. But yeah, maybe that's the way. Maybe that's the future manifesto.
I think that there's a lot to be said for a 21st century manifesto that is constructed of questions, for sure. Yeah. I think. I mean, there's an interesting question around, like, what is the organized aspect of the union in relation to this kind of this amorphous thing that is totally disorganized of sort of the big tent version of art, in which we welcome everyone. I think you spoke a bit about the question of of even fee, like a base minimum fees, but then even then, what is the work that we are defining there?
Yeah.
So that's two questions, but the one I think I'd like to go to first is the idea of what needs to be organized. Like, what is the organized aspect? There is the sort of defense of wage, but what else? What other kinds of mechanisms do you see in there?
What union's about to me is solidarity and creating a presence that is greater than one person. Like, so the idea that somebody has your back to a certain extent. I think we were trying to argue for that, and the idea that if someone messes with you, they're messing with more than one person. That's what a union's about, really, in an old school kind of labour sense. And I think we kind of wanted to create that. At least I did. I kind of viewed that was what we should be aiming to do for artists. So, if I see an artist being screwed over on the internet, if their work's being stolen, if they're being underpaid, if I find out about writers being underpaid, which I do a lot, I personally become really irate and angry about it. And I like the idea of there being potentially even tens of thousands of people sharing that anger at that moment, and how powerful that can be as a statement.
What's remarkable in some of the or many of the projects which we set out to challenge creatives and all kinds to come together to think about these relationship between technology and prosperity and creativity and how in a professional world, and even before the pandemic, I wouldn't say a resistance towards thinking of technology, but there was a zig around our zag in relation to the question of technology, and what it was towards was this idea of collective care. And I wonder if you think some of that is it a reaction to just the way technology is being used, or is there something inherent in technology which requires us, especially those steeped in the practice of creating with it, of needing something else to offset it?
There's something inherent in technology, I do think, to a certain extent. There's certainly something inherent in capitalism, and you can't separate the two. Right. I think that's really the crux. I mean, it's the crux of my kind of personal worldview. It's that you can't separate technology from capitalism. I'd like to be able to, but the technology we use and technology we build and we've entrapped ourselves in, for want of a better word, or we've committed to in certain ways, is fundamentally just an extension of capital. That's what it exists to do. Like, one of the things that I'm very obsessed with at the moment, especially around this issue, is this solidarity in withholding labour to a certain extent. I'm kind of trying to find a smart way of describing it at the moment, and the best I've come up with is this kind of idea of commitment creep. So this idea, like feature creep, which you talk about with software, where something like, I don't know, Photoshop has so many features added to it constantly, or your phone has so many features added to it constantly that it becomes unusable or bogged down or slow and what. I feel like that this is happening to artists in a while. We are being asked to commit to different types of work in order to continue to be workingized. Use an example. I mean, social media is like the obvious example. If you're an artist, you've got to be on social media in order to promote your work. Okay, but that's fair enough. There's a lot, it becomes a lot of labor, but I understand that. It's a good way of reaching out to people. Certainly my career is dependent on me being on Twitter all the time, which is, it's just like awful, but I have to do it.
Yeah,
right?
there's it's a real psychological cost.
Oh, it's a real,
It's not
very
only
real
the labor
psychological
cost, but that the fact that you are asked to be a part. You are, in order to make an artistic career, it is impossible.
It's
for
impossible
you
to not be on that, right? And as a journalist, even more so. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I get most of my work and I get most of my contacts as a freelancer via social media. People come to my work through social media. So it's impossible for me to abandon that, right? I joke with my other friends, especially journalist friends, we joke about how you don't want to be famous, just want to be successful enough that we can quit Twitter, right? And it's a very real feeling. It's a joke, but it's a very real feeling. But it's more, it becomes more than that because it's cranked up constantly, right? So, as a novelist who's a relatively newly published novelist, I was expecting to be told I had to have a social media account. And no one did tell me that because I was already very active in social media at that point. But then you're competing with everybody else on social media for attention. It's an attention economy. And you're constantly in competition with every other artist.
Yeah.
So you've instantly been put into a competitive situation where, at a time where I'm arguing for solidarity, right?
Yeah.
But then there's this commitment creep where it's like, okay, so you're on Twitter, right? But are you on Instagram? Okay, have you on Facebook? What about having a YouTube channel? What about doing a podcast? And this was the thing like this year that was going around in writers' communities, especially novelist communities, was you should start a podcast. And I look at I write in the science fiction area a bit, and the most successful science fiction writers all have podcasts, where they don't really talk about their own work, but they're talking about other people's work. Usually they're talking about work made by Disney. They're talking about work made by large corporations a lot of the time. So they're doing this incredibly time-intensive labor of running a podcast in order to promote their own work when they actually tend to be promoting, it feels like a lot of corporate work. And it's just this signal to noise ratio. You might be an author that's got a really interesting angle in your book, and a podcast makes perfect sense for it, especially in non-fiction books, they often make perfect sense. Or you may have this really amazing spin on telling your narrative that you can use, that podcast folds into. There's really clever and amazing ways of doing this, and I've encountered like a lot of people doing incredible work with this. But it becomes this competition, this composition mixed with this noise to signal ratio problem where I've got to have a podcast because you've got to have a podcast. And then we both have a podcast, and then everybody else has got to have a podcast, and everyone's an artist. And it's just like, I can't listen to all the podcasts, right? Do you know what I mean? No more than I can watch all the YouTube videos or read all the tweets. Plus, it's not just tweeting, having a podcast. It's like a full-time job. I know people who podcast for a living, and in order to do it well, they're spending like 12 hours to 20 hours a week just editing audio.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that.
To go back to this question of the technology and the and so is there something inherent in it? And I wonder in the work that your group sort of talked over and the way that you thought about this issue, is it possible to project a platform or to imagine a platform that does something different than what these existing platforms do? Or is there something inherent in platform capitalism that makes it impossible?
I think there's something inherent in platform capitalism, yeah.
The idea of a union in this context, we first take the stance that it is impossible to develop a care-oriented platform or a collective, and so we must repurpose the tools, knowing that they are tools that are inherently flawed, but repurpose them for some kind of collective action.
There's a couple of things there. I mean, the part of the collective action, I think, is refusing to do that labor. I think I was talking about this to some friends, and we were talking about the author podcast thing, and I was slightly dismayed this year. I won't mention any names. And an author whose work I really, really like and respect had a new novel out and launched a podcast to promote that novel. And I was okay, if you're doing it now, I feel like I need to do it, right? and I don't want that feeling. I don't want anybody to feel that. And I kind of like the idea of there being a work solidarity movement of authors that say, no, we are authors. We sit in a room and we write.
Mm-hmm.
Once every 2 years, we might come out and do a few talks here and there, or we might be on a panel, and we might tweet, and we might do things. But that is primarily what we do. We're authors. We're not stand-up comics. We're not radio DJs. We're not. If you want to do these things, then that's possible. But I think there's kind of like a kind of almost a refusal to do this, but across the board, right? You know, the idea that like including people whose profiles are very high, just saying like, you know, you don't have to do this as an author. You don't have to take on considerable labour outside the labour, because it's bad for you. It's bad for your practice, right? It's not just bad for you economically that you're not getting paid to do this labour and your time is being spent on unpaid labour, which is should be the primary concern of any union, right? To me,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also that it's bad for your practice.
Yeah.
If you're spending like 10 to 12 hours a week organising, editing, recording a podcast, it's 10 to 12 hours a week you've lost on your practice. Right?
Yeah.
And that's what we should always be fighting for, is the ability to spend as much time as that on our practice, right? So I kind of like the idea of the union representing a stand against that, which was kind of exaggerated into the general strike ideas that we had, which was also about fighting against platform capitalism, about giving this unpaid labour, which is being turned directly into capital by these platforms, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, we create art, we put our own emotions, we create our own feelings. Anything we produce online, it basically becomes just a content between advertising.
Mm.
There's a whole other thing there with that economy is on the brink of collapse. It's fairly clear now, looking at, you know, like Tim Hwang's work and the stuff he's done around the attention economy and ad tech, that you know, probably in the next, it feels very imminent, and possibly in the next 12 months, we're going to see another collapse of the online advertising market. Not exactly, but very similar to how we did in the late 80s, early 2000s, right? And the massive impact that had on online industries. But just that, you know, we can't, it's, I guess what I'm saying, it's not a firm enough infrastructure to provide us an income, advertising, and it's not getting to us anyway, right, as artists. It's getting absorbed by other people. It's getting absorbed by, or it's getting, a small amount of it is going to a very, very small percentage of people at the top. Mm-hmm. This kind of influences economy, the people that have been able to leverage these platforms in order to make money. And I don't want to go around saying this isn't art what they're doing, but a lot of what they're doing, the people I see doing the most interesting art aren't those people, right? Because you can't do the most interesting art whilst being restricted by what makes you popular, right? Which isn't, like, you know, obviously a centuries old concern, but whenever I talk about these things, whether it's art related or infrastructure related, that everybody sort of, but that's not new. It's always been like that. It's true. But it wasn't always like that on a global scale, and it didn't always happen in nanoseconds, right? That's the difference.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it was the idea of thinking it was always like that. There are themes that are perhaps, you know, struggles that have been going on. So sometimes that can be depressing to think that the struggle hasn't really, you know, resolved itself in any way, but also that it hasn't been like that everywhere simultaneously.
Exactly.
Right. That's exactly. Like it has been. You know, there's a thread that
there's
that
a
you
sense
can
of
follow.
scale to it, which is really hard for us to A, imagine, and B, kind of realize where it places us.
Yeah.
And it makes it incredibly harder for artists to get attention if that's what you're looking for, which as artists we unfortunately usually are, right? The problem that comes out of this is also as artists, I don't want to be denying anybody the use of these platforms.
Yeah.
So that's where the conflict is. I don't want to say, if you've got a fantastic idea that works best on YouTube or as a podcast, and as an artist you want to do that, then by all means do that.
Yeah, and there's a long history of artists and creatives intervening in dominant modes of communication, participating, creating television, popular music that is...
Exactly.
But I think, in thinking about collective action, I wonder, and when I was looking at the day of action that that was part of the proposal or the speculation, and I wondered if you had speculated on other ways of seeing that collective action happen. I mean, and as we were talking now, I started to think about, well, one of the issues is time, right? Like a singular day of action, as shortened as the timescale of life is, synchronous time is actually not something we experience, but it's this, what if it was more like spores of growing, and kind of like a day of action that's really not a day of action, but is like a deflection, or a constantly growing and expanding kind of.
Yeah, that makes the most sense. I think we went with the days of action because they're headline grabbing, right? And you kind of have to pull those stunts, I think, initially. And how effective that would be the only way to find out is to try it to a certain extent, right? What if we could organize a day where nobody posted new content to YouTube or to TikTok or anything? It's almost impossible to do, probably. I just wrote an article for 1.0 about complexity, and you start looking at I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but literally, it's years worth of video that are uploaded to YouTube every hour, right?
Yeah.
So being able to organize on that scale maybe is unrealistic.
Yeah.
But if you only have to get a certain number of high-profile artists or people with large followings in for it to become a headline grabber, right? If you can, I don't know, if you can get Kim Kardashian to not tweet, to not post to Instagram for a day, suddenly someone takes notice, right? But that's also not what we're aiming to do. We're not trying to make it about personalities. So it's a hard one. It's a tricky one to pull off. I think as a stunt, I think as a symbolic gesture, as a polemic, I think it can be incredibly powerful.
I know that you guys played with this notion of speculation and sort of, is it more powerful, or is it as powerful an idea in the speculation? Like, is there a way to keep elaborating on that, or is it to try to keep making it happen so that it feels real?
I think what ifs are always powerful. I wouldn't be in the business I'm in if they weren't, right? Do you know what I mean? And I don't think any artists would really. I mean, at some level, all art is a what if question, right? At some level. It has to break out of that at some point to be effective, yeah. It's weird. It's hard to. I wrote a book about destroying the internet, and then spent the last few months watching people like actually trying to destroy the internet in certain parts of the world, which was both like exciting and then also terrifying because they were doing it for the wrong reasons. I mean, like, I have very real issues with 5G technology and what it signifies as it's run by private corporations. But that doesn't mean I want people setting fire to. Maybe I do want people setting fire to towers, but not because they think it spreads COVID. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I want them to set fire to towers because they can see that it's a privatization of the radio spectrum in certain ways, right? Do you know what I mean? So I think if I expand my union thing out to logical conclusion, what I'm really arguing for is some sort of nationalization of a lot of infrastructure that artists use. Right? I wouldn't have a problem with us all being on YouTube as much or Twitter as much if those infrastructures, and they are infrastructure, right? And this is it's very core to my personal work is to arguing to have these platforms identified as essential infrastructure because they've become essential infrastructure for so many people, whether it's a communication platform or an infrastructure for artists to work on. To argue for these places being infrastructure and then treating them as you would want to see infrastructure treated. Now, in neoliberal capitalism, that means a lot of the time just open it up to the free market anyway, right? Because that's how communication infrastructure and transport infrastructure is handled.
Except that in those cases, I mean, even if it is moving the dial somewhat, the notion of regulation is not thrown out the window.
No,
It's not
exactly,
like wildly,
exactly.
like what are you talking about? Why
Exactly.
would we regulate the construction of roads?
Exactly. You might privatize buses, but you don't deregulate them in the same way that anybody can just have a bus and drive around, which is kind of apparently what Silicon Valley want to be able to do, right? Which is what Uber is and what Lyft are. They're like the complete deregulation of transport infrastructure, and I'm really arguing for a movement away from that, especially for artists. I would love to see, my wife, who's an academic and thinks about privacy issues a lot, and her research is around privacy in education and surveillance in education specifically. She has this wonderful idea she talks about a lot about taking Twitter, breaking it up and giving it to libraries to run. What if your local, Twitter was a local thing and it was run by your library, or an organization like your library in your neighborhood. So it would be like a kind of mesh network system, I imagine, where it was connected to every other Twitter in the world, but like breaking it down into these smaller parts so that it's not centralized. It's not Jack Dorsey sitting in Silicon Valley on his shamanic retreat or whatever he's doing, dictating what's become now the most important news and political communication network infrastructure globally. Right?
And there gets to be isn't Mastodon a bit?
Mastodon's built similar around those lines. Yeah, I've not. Yeah. And this is what's like for me. For me personally, I struggle with. I have a Mastodon account. I've never used it because I don't have the emotional energy to start working out how to use another platform. Right? Because I'm burnt out on all the platforms I'm on now. I just got a TikTok account like weeks ago because I'm writing a book about TikTok, right? And I looked at it and used it and was aware of it. But I was had put off actually getting involved in it just because I don't have the emotional reserves to invest in another. And some of that's my age. I get that, right? I'm a bit old now. I'm like, I don't need to be doing this stuff. And 10 years ago, I was the guy that signed up to Twitter within a month of it starting. And every other platform, Facebook, as soon as it was open to the public, I was on there because it looked interesting. Now there's a burnout. I mean,
but there are so many.
There's so many, right? And you're told that this is the new one. And as artists, you're told that this is the new one. You're a visual artist, well, why aren't you on Instagram? I have photography friends, like gallery photography friends, photographer friends, and news photographer friends, who they won't go on Instagram. They fight really hard, and people say to them, "But where can I see your work? It's not on Instagram." That's and. Why should they? To some extent.
I want to go back to the question of the state and government, and because I think it's something interesting that comes up around what a lot of the organization and the idea of organized labor within this creative context is in some ways pushing for. Like where does it make perhaps more sense for the state to be involved in these things, and where does it make more sense? Like, is this impetus towards and the desire towards organized labor maybe come from the fact that we have both a weakened state and an overpowerful corporate structure?
Yeah, very much so. I think,
and we need we need a stronger state as well, or is it? And I wonder if you guys have thought about the different roles there.
Yeah, a little bit. I think one of my own personal bugbears is we talk about community a lot, and we don't talk about the state. And to me, I like to believe that the two are the same thing, right? That community seems like a nebulous term a lot of the times, and it's used in ways that used by corporations a lot. Like Disney used the term community constantly. Right? What they mean is customers, and what they mean is audience. And consumers is what they mean, but they used to use community as a fill-in for that. Or the Star Wars community, the Marvel community expects it. We are addressing needs of consumers, and you're selling products to consumers. But I like the idea of the state being a community. I think the two can interact and be the same thing at times, right? We've also, neoliberalism has demonized the state into being this very much top-down thing. Mm-hmm. The same way corporations are a top-down thing. And that's not the state to me. The state is us. Right? If something is owned by the state, it means it's owned by us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I got very upset today. I saw a story on the BBC about back in the UK. 1 in 4 people questioned during the pandemic thought that too many people were getting welfare payments because they were out of work. And they interviewed a bunch of young women, it turned out, who had claimed unemployment benefit for the first time during the pandemic, and they were ashamed of doing it. And they put off doing it to the last minute until they were really desperate for money in order to do it. That is your money.
Yeah.
It's money that you've paid in, you know, they're getting like 400 quid a month. These people were paying more than that in taxes a month. I'm sure they were. And national insurance payments and such like, right? It's your money. It's there for you.
Yeah.
It's assigned for you to use in these situations. We've broken that relationship so that the state is part of the other, or part of the domination of us, rather than it being the community that we're in. This, like you said, this caring community. You know, I want a state that's built around care and responsibility for each other.
Yeah.
And this was
the classic of the 80s, late 80s and 90s of like the nanny state, that the nanny, this sort of like
what's wrong with nannies,
sexist,
man?
like that someone who was taking care of you was a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What's wrong with being taken care of, especially if it's a communal taking care of you?
Yeah.
I sound like an old lefty hippie, I know that.
But we don't have enough hair for that.
Yeah, we don't have enough. Remco's not here, sadly.
But it's interesting to think, like, what could you imagine the role, like, to think of the union as a way towards pushing and getting the public to understand not just the physical infrastructure of the network and technology in general, but the actual sort of platforms as well as public infrastructure, as there being public value. And much of it is too, right? Then you think of, like, you know, I mean, America has the Silicon Valley myth is built on a falsehood that there is, like, how much national defense money was spent on foundational technologies that things are then built on top of.
Exactly.
So I wonder how a union could play, and I don't know that this has come up in your conversations, but it does through this conversation, thinking, how could a union play a role in transforming the perception of this infrastructure as public, as a public space?
Yeah, it would certainly be a campaign I'd like to see this kind of union very, very invested in. And we're artists, right? So it's an artist union. We should be using art to make these points. I'm hoping that that's kind of what I do in my art to a certain extent, is to argue for these points. And then it's like, you know, I certainly interact and work with other artists that are kind of arguing those points. And I think really sort of solidarity movements like the kind of general content strike thing that we were kind of talking about, that we kind of speculative strike that we based the project around, I think we hopefully would highlight this. You know, they would highlight at least that the community is creating the content, right? That the content is, you can't log on to YouTube or Spotify even, right, every day and there's magically music for you to listen to on Spotify. Someone made that music, and it's important, I think, to realize that's coming from the community as much as it's coming from...
Yeah, and that there is a collectivism needed to, I think that's the relation, the act of the union to think collectively, like, there isn't anyone, we can try to make better, you know, decisions to not be on social media because it's for our own mental health, but it's not going to transform the platforms.
Exactly.
We need collective action either through the state or some other mechanism that's going to take care to try and make it
so my kind of big picture is break up these corporations and nationalize them, right? Which I know is incredibly, like, probably unrealistic and in many ways unpopular thing to do. The alternatives are we build our own platforms, but then that becomes problematic in certain ways. And it's not necessarily something that artists should be doing. Maybe they should certainly be involved in the design, maybe of kind of platforms.
But it does extend the question of the sort of internalization of the Silicon Valley, sort of like, well, you should build your own.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what the answer is.
Exactly, exactly. Which is what people say to me constantly. Well, what have you built? You know, and it's hugely frustrating. It's not the point. You know, it's not the answer. But at the same time, we are building these platforms. These platforms don't exist without our labour. Both as audiences and content producers. I think that's something that that needs to be rammed home to people as much as possible and explained and illustrated to people. I was always surprised. A few years ago when I was living in New York, a friend of mine invited me to come and talk to her class, who were master's students, design master's students, at it was at Pratt, it's a big design school in New York, in Manhattan. Would you come and talk to them about digital labor? And these kids were all like in their early to mid 20s. And I was like, really? They're like, really? You want me to stand up in front of 20-year-olds and tell them about digital labor, and they're going to look at me and they're going to eye roll and go, yeah, we know this, granddad, whatever. We're aloof, and I was absolutely shocked. I went into that class, none of them were aware of these concepts at all. I started explaining to them that, you know, when you realize, if you're watching a YouTube video and you click like, you are working for Google. You've created value for Google. Your labor has created directly value for Google because you're teaching their algorithms on what popular content is, and you're teaching their ad tech networks what you like, and then you're directly creating. And I stood there and slack jaws and wide eyes. These kids hadn't really considered this before, and that suddenly became a lot of motivation stuff that ended up me talking about in DAL, because it was very much, I thought people knew this, right? Do you know what I mean? I thought that more people understood this than apparently do, right?
Yeah.
And it's very, it was a real eye opener at that moment for me. And I think we nearly did constantly kind of pushing that education to people, that awareness of how these structures really work, and the labor you do just as an audience. You don't have to be creating content to be performing labor on these sites, right? As soon as you use them, as soon as you watch a video, the value of what you're watching is being directly turned into something that's used to create capital.
Well, that idea too of privacy that it still remains within the frame of this, you know, it's not framed in the way that it's not a question of like being surveillance, it's a question of feeling like it is private.
Yeah.
Right? Like it is in the realm of that this is not, I don't need to leave a digital trail wherever I go. I would be okay with that.
Yeah.
Going back to this question of, you know, we were talking about artists and change, and like us trying to imagine, you know, new ways of being, and I think sort of like as we were talking about the organized aspects. I wonder if you could talk a bit about, you know, you straddle these worlds of fiction and journalism all the time, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about sort of speculative, the speculative work that you've done, and how not only has it sort of helped in this case of thinking through organized labor in relation to the creative world, but generally, how does that speculative design or speculative fiction that you engage in a lot of ways engage these real life issues? Like what's the role of that?
It's weird. I've fallen into a place where the two are kind of inseparable to me for a while, which is a really, like, in the current climate of how the media is viewed by a lot of political actors, is a kind of weirdly strange thing to admit to doing, that people don't want to see lines blurred between like the real and the fake or whatever. And it's strange. I don't think there's any issues that I write purely fiction or non-fiction about. I'm writing about both all the time. And I'm realizing now, after doing it for 5 years, that that's my practice. My practice is doing both, right? So, you know, I've got, for example, I've just got, like, just a couple of weeks ago, started a new column for 10, which is part of Medium, so another one of these big platforms, right? But they're paying me like almost a living wage to write this column for them, which is about complexity issues, of a lot of the stuff we're talking about now on platforms, and about how the complexity of networks and the economy and the internet has a direct impact on democracy because we don't understand it. But that was what my novel was also about that. And I've written short fiction that came out of that. And that, in turn, a lot of that came out of reporting I did 5 years ago when I went to China and looked at supply chains. So these things are just constantly feeding into each other all the time. Excuse me. And it's impossible for me to separate them, apart from when I'm sitting down to actually do the work, to write them down. You know, I'm writing a novel at the moment which is about social media again and influencer culture to a certain extent, which again is based off of an article which actually hasn't been published yet, but I got a lot of the, you know, I wrote an article about Funko Pops, you know, those stupid little toys with the big heads. I wrote an article about that for Vice just before the pandemic started. And it ended up being about fan culture in those things and how people relate to physical items. And it's inspired, straight out of that, I've started writing a novel based on this concept, right? This idea of how fan cultures and how they interact with infrastructures and stuff. In some ways, it's easy and it's lazy for me because I don't have to do twice as much research. I'm always constantly working on the same topics. But it's also an emotional thing for me. I like it, like that. For example, like the stuff I wrote about going to China and looking at supply chains, spending time in container ships. All that stuff was published by the BBC, and I loved publishing it through the BBC. There's a lot of restrictions, especially to length. I wasn't allowed to write more than 2,000 words on any of in the articles, which I felt like it needed a lot more. But it didn't matter because I was getting out to such a large audience, and that was really important to me with those topics. You know, talking about where, you know, your everyday plastic items from China, how they get to you, and the labor and the infrastructure and the complexity and the algorithms and everything that's involved in getting, you know, this cup to you from China, right? It is something that I feel is such an important fundamental thing to all of us that I need to get out to a wider audience as possible. You know, I could have written that article for maybe Atlantic, or written a much longer piece for you know, a more politically interested publication, but it wouldn't got out to the audience. I got it out to from I think something like 500,000 people read those stories, or something ridiculous over in the last 5 years that they've been up, right? So, you know, I getting that out to that number of people is incredibly important to me. But at the same time, the restrictions that come with that are very emotional for me as well. Like, so, you know, I sat there, wrote an article about, you know, visiting Christmas decorations factory in Yiwu in China. And the BBC were very accommodating for me and allowed me to describe what the environment was there. But I came away with it was haunted by what I'd seen, right? In all the factories I visited in China. So I ended up writing fiction about that, because that was the way that I could get that other stuff out. And I wrote initially a very experimental short story, which is up on Medium, called Special Economic Zone, which is about, it's literally the same paragraph repeated like 20 times. And it was I stood for half an hour in a electronics components factory in Shenzhen and watched this one guy testing little GPS chips. And he literally just had to plug them into a thing. And if the light went green, they were fine. If they went red, if the light went green, they went in one box. If the light went red, they went in another box. And he did that for the half hour that I stood watching him. And he'd done that for 12 hours that day, I was told. And he lived in a dormitory which was next door to the thing. When we went to the dormitories, there were these horrible little crappy rooms with 4 kids on bunk beds playing World of Warcraft on laptops. That was their existence, right? And I wanted to kind of, you know, with the story, it's just the same paragraph repeated, but sometimes the light's red and sometimes it's green. And then there's a break where they go and have lunch or go and play games, and then they come back and they do it again. And these kids were like, you know, 16, 17 years old. And I wanted the story to be really challenging. So like, if you can't get through reading this, you can't get through doing this kid's job, right? You know, it's that mundane and that repetitive. And that was something that I couldn't get into the BBC articles. I couldn't get that emotional angle into it. So that's why speculation works for me. That's why it's really important to me, is to be able to envision. It's both emotionally present stuff and envision stuff. Maybe I'll get to a point in my career when I'm starting to be more positive about things, and I can start positioning like alternative futures, which are good. But I tend to, my work tends to skew the other way, where I'm trying to look at how bad things are in order to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that there was a part of that, the question that I guess I was inkling towards the positive only because we were talking about organized labor. Although much of that, even if it's in a mode towards a better way of being, is often about resistance to
It is about resistance.
to trying to create
It's
a
about
bottom
resistance, yeah.
in which we will not push
like,
beyond.
as someone whose work gets called dystopian a lot, and I'm not happy. I'm not particularly. I don't think the term dystopia is particularly. What I saw in China was dystopian to me.
Yeah.
But that's not a dystopia. That's people's real existence. Right?
Yeah.
So to belittle it by calling it like a science fiction
Yeah.
dystopia is offensive on some level to me. And these things are dystopian if they're happening down the road from you, but they're not if they're on another continent and you don't need to see them, but you get the end product of it neatly delivered to you.
Well, that's
Like, do you know what I mean?
I think that's a really interesting aspect of what you were saying, that what the speculation and what the fiction allows, and that the news form is about a kind of reductive, circulable form of information.
Yeah.
But that, the sort of entangled emotional complexity of contemporary life needs other forms.
It needs something else, yeah. And that's I mean, we're artists, right? That's what we do. I think, or me personally as an artist, that's my practice.
Yeah.
And I think it is for most artists whose work I enjoy and relate to, even if it's not almost the most obvious thing they're doing, they're trying to tackle that sense of complexity and emotional kind of confusion that comes with a lot of modern life. So and it's like it's too easy as well to say, well, people say to me, or I see people saying, dystopias aren't helpful, or being negative isn't helpful enough. You need to create positive alternatives. And people have been doing that for decades and it is useful, and it's we need both of those things, right? But, I look at the number of Silicon Valley CEOs that cite Star Trek as a positive future. They're in no way working towards that kind of future, right? This is a future where money is illegal. People miss that in the Federation, money is actually illegal, right? It's illegal on Earth to have money. It's been banned, it's been outlawed. The capital has been outlawed in Star Trek. But the world's greatest capitalists, including Jeff Bezos, will tell you endlessly about how this is the future that he's trying to build. And he's not. And in order for us to understand, in order for us to build positive futures, we need to understand what's negative about the present in order to directly, fix that, to stop it, to change it, right? And yeah, it's a tricky one. It upsets people when I talk like this a lot of the time.
But is that then like kind of the, I would call it the punchline, but maybe one of the most telling aspects of some of the speculative component of a day of action is that you already envisioned its inevitable failure.
Yes.
And then that becomes then, we will work at this even though it will fail, and that is part of that failure, is drawing out the complexity as to why.
So in the day of action thing, I wrote a fake news article, a fake Guardian news article. I don't know if you've seen it. It's part of the project. The idea being that when the speculative project started, there's already been one day of action, and we're organising for a second day of action. The difference being that after the first day of action, some of the platforms, Facebook, banned the union because what they were doing was against the terms of services, and it was actively dissuading people from using Facebook as against Facebook's terms of services, right? Actively disrupting Facebook. Facebook, speculatively speaking, had found a way of making these platforms illegal, and that had then also, I think, been overturned later. But it was enough to it was interesting because it was enough, I felt, in a way, to make the union more militant in a way. You need to have something that everybody's solid, it comes against to fight against it when you're organising politically like this. And as much of it was a perfect example for me, and as a writer, that you organise people against the platform, that platform fights back. It should make that organisation stronger. It should make it easier for you to recruit people. You go, hey, look, see what's happening. Ironically, the right is very good at doing this, right? We've seen this during the pandemic, we saw it during the Trump, and we saw it during Brexit. We saw how the right has used them being banned from social media for very valid reasons as an argument to say that these platforms are anti-democratic, right? Which they are in other ways. So everything's complicated and difficult to outline in a lot of ways. But I kind of like the idea, of it failing. But you take failures as political organizers, as activists, as anyone who's really in a fight. You have to take these failures as expected and as rallying cries, right? And as ways of doubling down on your efforts in a lot of ways, or readdressing your tactics, or wherever they are. Mm-hmm. I'm saying this like I'm an organizer. I'm speaking here, I'm speaking very speculative, because the last thing I am in the world, and I put my hand on the heart and say the last thing I am is a political organizer, right? Mm-hmm. I don't pretend to be.
Yeah.
I know people that do that. And these people are the most incredible people in the world. Yeah. And people who go away and spend 2 decades, dedicate 2 decades, 3 decades of their lives to a cause. That's how the civil rights movement happened in the US. It was people dedicating decades to it, white people as well as black people, dedicating their lives to giving up parts of their lives for a cause. It's very different from, clicking like on a tweet or retweeting, all the sort of stuff that I do, right? It's like, tweeting links to news stories and saying, this is terrible, look at this, and then moving on to the next thing. That's not real organization. And when you guys ask me for a reference for the HoloMag thing, I get the Astra Taylor article, which is called Against Activism, which is arguing for the difference between activism and organizing. And we seem to be very occupied with activism and not organizing at the moment. And I think that's I wanted to kind of scratch at that a little bit with the DEL, with the Union Project. It's very easy to, on one level, to say, hey, don't upload anything to YouTube for a day, or don't do any Instagram stories for a day, or don't watch anything on Facebook, don't click on any ads for a day. It's very easy to do that. But it becomes gimmicky and people can move on for it. And we need to be in for that project would only work if it was there for a longer run and people dug in and people dedicated a certain part of their lives. Instead of doing that podcast on the off chance that 12 people might listen to it and buy your book, maybe take that time and put it into to doing some kind of collective action. Like I say, it's very easy for me to say this when I'm not actually physically doing it, right? Do you know what I mean?
No, but it's interesting that part of the essential work that we wanted to do in the Digital Economies Lab was to think around what kind of infrastructure is missing, and what can artists play in imagining at least the early stages of it. There's no we shouldn't have a pretense that we have the resources to really build the infrastructure in our tiny organization with our tiny ragtag group of critical thinkers, but we can imagine what infrastructure is missing and begin to sort of push towards that. And I think that's a really interesting point about this nature of the need for organization in some form. And if it doesn't look like what has come before, because there are certainly really valuable arts organizations that are meta organizations serving other arts organizations, but there's something still missing.
Yeah.
And whether that's it being about 21st century technology or the 21st century condition of globalization fully realized, it's tough to say, but I think that's a really important and interesting point going forward. Well, I think this has been a fascinating and rich conversation. Thanks very much for spending the time with us in real space.
In real space,
real space, in the TV space of...
It's the first face-to-face meeting I've had in a few months, and you managed to do it on the day it was minus 20 degrees out. So well done.
Thank you for coming out of a bubble. Although all of us, to get that opportunity, we know it's safe. We're like, that's going to feel great. I'm going to be around other people.
Yeah.
And, even if I'm really awkwardly far from them. So from over here on the other side.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me and for letting me ramble endlessly about stuff.
I hope we do it again.
Yeah, I'm sure we will.